Hello there, Lawrence Grayson back again for shortformvideo.com with another After Effects tutorial for you to get your teeth into. And this time it's a satellite tracking effect, very similar to the one you'll find in the mission briefing stages in the Modern Warfare game series, and it's in response to a viewer request that I had recently. Now, a lot of you will probably be looking at it and thinking, I can do that already, in which case that's fine, go and do it. For those of you that can't and don't want to really watch the tutorial, you'll be pleased to know that the project file is already up on my website for free download, so go to shortformvideo.com and you'll find it there. So if we look at the kind of finished project, you'll see we've got a number of elements that need to be created. We've got the center reticle here. We've got these dials around the outside and a nice little indicator, some placeholders for the text, and some totally arbitrary measurement lines to the left and the right. So let's create the first element, which is the crosshair reticle in the middle. So I'm going to start by creating a new composition, and we'll make this 300 by 300 pixels, and we'll set it to 10 seconds long and hit OK. So the first stage is to select your rectangle tool, make sure the fill is set to off, and we'll pick a stroke of white and a stroke width of 4 pixels. Now, holding down the Shift key to lock it into a square, just drag it to the size you want in your new composition. And we'll just twirl down the rectangle path properties, and we'll set it to 200 by 200 pixels, and we'll just make sure it's centered up properly by going to the transform rectangle position and make sure that those are set to 0 and 0 respectively, and that'll line it up perfectly in the middle. Now, with the shape layer still selected, hit Ctrl Shift and N to create a new mask, and then Ctrl T to bring up the edit properties for that mask, and we're just going to drag the edge of the mask bounding boxes into the middle. Tap M to bring up the mask properties and change it from add to subtract, and we'll tap M twice to bring up the rest of the properties, and we might just expand it by 10 pixels. Now that's not quite centered, so I'm going to tap the apostrophe key to bring up the guidelines. And with the mask path selected, I'm just going to use the cursor keys to nudge it into the center. So with mask number 1 selected, hit Ctrl and D, and then Ctrl T to bring up the bounding box again, and we're just going to repeat the process. So we get a horizontal mask this time. Okay, now go to your pen tool, and you should still have the fill unselected and the stroke of 4. So I'm just going to head to the center point at the top and click once, hold down Shift and click again, and that'll lock it to a vertical layer, and that just creates a straight line and a new shape layer. So twirl down the contents and the shape properties and then the stroke properties, and next to where it says dashes, hit the plus sign to add some dashes. Now we've got 4 here, that's actually more than I want, so I'm going to increase the dash size to about 20. Now we need 3 more of those, so select shape number 1 in the shape layer 2 and just hit Ctrl and D to duplicate it 3 times. And we're just going to use the transform properties for the shape layer, and just rotate it, and then on shape layer 3 rotate it to 180, and then shape layer 4 rotate it to 270. And that'll give us our crosshairs. Again, go to the pen tool and just create a short line over the center point and just make sure it's centered. So that's actually pretty good. So again, I'm going to hit Ctrl D on shape 1, twirl down the transform properties and just rotate it by 90 degrees. And that'll give us our crosshair in the center. Now there's one more element we need to add at this stage. So go to the rectangle tool and holding down Shift to lock it to a square again, just draw another square in the center of the reticle. Twirl down the transform properties and just make sure it's centered off. Turn the stroke off by tapping the eye icon next to stroke 1 and turn the fill on, and we'll just set that color to white as well. Now if we go back to the preview, you'll see that that square is actually flashing on and off, and that's pretty simple to achieve. So with the shape layer 4, which is our center square selected, I'm going to hit T to bring up the opacity values and just create a keyframe at the beginning of the timeline, which is set to 0. Go to the 1 second mark and create another keyframe which is set to 100%, and then just hit page down about 5 times, and that'll advance by 5 frames, and we'll create another keyframe back down to 0. And you'll see that's created a single flash. To get that to repeat, hold down Alt and click on the stopwatch and type loop out open bracket close bracket. And now when I RAM preview that, you'll see we've got our flashing square. Now it's actually not flashing quickly enough for me, so what I'm going to do is just select all of the keyframes that I created for the opacity and hold down Alt. And we'll just drag the end keyframe in, and that'll rescale all the keyframes and speed up the entire animation. So that's pretty much the way I want it to be. Okay, so that's the center reticle done. So I might just rename that composition center reticle. Next thing we're going to do is create the dials around the outside. So right click, select new composition. We're going to make this a little bit bigger, so we'll make this 500 by 500 pixels, and we'll call this dials. And just hit OK. Back to your shape tool, get the ellipse tool out, and you can just again hold down Shift to lock it to a circle and just drag the circle out. We're still using a stroke of 4 pixels, so it'll all match nicely, and a fill to off. Twirl down the ellipse, find the transform properties and just set the position values to 0 to lock it into the center. Now we're going to increase the stroke width from 4 up to about 20. Now the reason we're doing that is because we're going to create some dashes, and we want them to be fairly wide. So where it says dashes, click on the plus sign to create a set of dashes, and hit the plus sign again to create a gap. Now what we're going to do now is just play around with the dash size and the gap size until we get something that looks how we want it to look. Now I want these dashes to be fairly thin, so value of 2 pixels, and by increasing the gap value you can create a set of dials that matches up. So we've actually got standard clock face, so this is the handy little trick if you want to create a quick clock face, and I'm pretty happy with that. So what we're going to do now is just duplicate the ellipse. So we've got ellipse 2. We're going to take the stroke width down to 10, and then twirl down the dashes property. And I'm going to reduce the gap value considerably. So we've got our major dashes, and now we've got some minor ones. So I've taken it to a gap of 14. That seems to work pretty well. So I'm just going to twirl down the transform properties for ellipse 2 and just reduce the scale until it's on the inside edge of our larger dashes. So that looks pretty cool. Now I'm going to duplicate shape layer 1, so I've got an exact match in shape layer 2. Twirl down ellipse 1, find the transform properties and scale, and we're going to reduce the scale to, well, let's make a nice round 50%. And in ellipse 2, find the transform properties and reduce the scale until they're on the outside, which is 52%. And that's how we've created our dials. Now the great thing about doing it like this is they're easy to keyframe. Because they're smack in the center, you can just hit the rotation value and the whole thing will spin around its axis. So what I might do is just create a basic rotation keyframe at the beginning, and we'll set it to a full rotation at the end of the timeline. So that'll just sit and spin in the middle. And then shape layer 1, going to do the same thing, create a rotation keyframe at the beginning, hit end to take us to the end of the timeline, and I'll hit -1 at the end of the timeline. And that way they'll both rotate in the opposite direction. Now the next thing we're going to do is create a little triangular indicator. So find your polygon tool and just draw a small polygon. Under the polystar properties, go to path and points and drop that down to 3, and that'll turn it from a pentagon into a triangle, obviously. And set the rotation to 0, and we'll drop the outer radius right down to 12. Now the stroke's a little on the heavy side, so I'm going to take the stroke width down to 2. And in the transform properties, again, I'm going to find the position values and hit 0 and 0 to match it up with the center. And then in the anchor point, I'm going to adjust the y-axis until our triangle is pointing towards the outer dial. And again, you can now keyframe that to rotate around the inside of the dial however you like. Okay, so that's our dials created. Our next element is to create another new composition, and we'll actually set this to the same size as our final composition, which in my case is the favorite 720p preset. And just hit OK and just rename that bars. And we're going to do a similar thing that we've done with the dials. Just find your pen tool, go to the outside edge of your frame, click once to create a starting point, hold down shift to lock it to the vertical, and click again to create an endpoint. What I might do is just nudge that in to line it up with the inside edge. I'm going to go to the stroke values, add some dashes and a gap, increase the stroke width to 30, and then the gap now let's just take the dash size down to 2 to make it nice and narrow, and I'm just going to increase the gap size to 136 so we get a nice starting point and end point. Now we can duplicate shape 1, twirl down the stroke values, and I'm just going to hit the minus key to get rid of the dashes in the gap, and take the stroke width back down to 2. And in the transform, I'm just going to adjust the X position to line our new shape up against with the edges of our indicator marks. Now you can add some numbers here. You know how to do that. For the sake of simplicity, I'm just going to duplicate shape layer 1, tap R to bring up the rotation values and rotate it by 180, and that'll repeat it on the other side. And I'm just going to tap S to scale it down to about 90%. and that gives us this slightly different offset edge on the other side. Now if you like, you can add a couple of polystars like I did before, so polystar path down to 3 points. Oops. Rotation 90. Actually, we'll make the rotation 270. And drop the outer radius down to 15. Set it to -250. Hit a keyframe. Create another one that has it dropping. So I'll take that down to 1. I knew you already know how to get keyframes, so none of this will be new to you. So we're just about ready to add them all together. I'm going to create a new composition, and we'll call this one main comp. And I've set it to 720p. Just hit OK. So what we're going to do now is we're going to bring all of these elements in together. So center reticle, bars, and dials. Now that actually looks pretty good as it is. But if we go back to the satellite tracking preview, you'll see there's a little bit more to it than that. We start off by having just the reticle, and we'll keyframe these dials so that they appear. So we'll go to the 2-second mark, which will make it the 4-second mark. So find the dials, tap S to bring up the scale, create a keyframe, take the scale down to 0. Tap page down to about 5, and then take the scale value back up to 100. Actually, they're a little bit on the small side. I might make the last keyframe a bit bigger. Take them up to 150. And at the 5-second mark, I'll just create an opacity keyframe of 0 on the bars. Tap shift and page down to advance 10 frames, and we'll have the bars fade in at that point as well. Now you'll notice that when we get to a certain point, the reticle changes to indicate that you found your target. In my case, it's at the 5-second mark. So if you want to do something like that, let's say put it on the 5-second mark, we'll go to the center reticle, and we'll find the center shape, which is the square, and we'll just crop that to that mark so it disappears. And we'll do the same with all of the other elements except for the main crosshairs. So to create that alternatively flashing rectangle in the middle, the simplest way to do that is to find your rectangle tool, and we'll just draw it in by hand in the middle. Turn the stroke off and set the fill to white. And that's the top half. Just trim that to match the out point of the previous element. Tap T to bring up the opacity values. Create a keyframe at the in point. Hold down Shift and tap page down to advance by 10 frames. Create another keyframe of 0. Shift and page down for another 10 frames and take it back up to 100%. Hold down Alt, click on the stopwatch, and we'll type in loop out, open bracket, close bracket, and as we now know, that'll repeat that keyframed expression. And all I'm going to do now is duplicate that shape layer, nudge it down so it's beneath the bar, and just offset it. So when the top rectangle is fading in, the bottom rectangle is fading out. So go back to our main comp. We'll see we've got the reticle, flashing square, dials pop out, and about the 5-second mark it swaps to the flashing rectangles and the bars come in either side. So our last step is to create something to track over. So I've got this satellite image of Australia. So I'm going to drop that underneath it. Go to your Effects and Presets panel and find the grid effect and drop that onto your satellite map. Select width sliders and we'll just increase that to about 80. Take the border down to 2 and we'll select the blending mode to screen, and that'll just create a nice grid on the satellite map. And basically all you need to do now is keyframe the position of your satellite map until it's where you want it to be. I might just add some curves to the satellite map because it's a little bit bright. So I'll crunch it down a bit. Now, other thing I did in the preview is add a mosaic. So in the Effects and Presets panel, find your mosaic effect, drag it onto your satellite map. Increase the vertical blocks to about 200 and the horizontal blocks to the same, and you'll get this pixelated effect. Now I've made a little bit of a mistake here. I've added it after the grid. Now to correct that, I'm just going to drag the mosaic effect and put it on top of the effect stack, so it applies the mosaic first, then the grid, then the curves. So now we've got a slightly pixelated effect. When we get to the point where we've just about locked on, I'm going to create a keyframe for the horizontal blocks, nudge the timeline indicator a little bit further forward, and we'll take it to 1280 and 720 to match the resolution of our output project. And that'll create a resolution increase when you've locked on your target. Now, I think that's about all I've got time to cover here. One thing I haven't really looked at is the creation of the text, but all this is linear wipe and rectangles with text on top of them, so I'll probably leave you to work that one out for yourself. But as I say, if you don't fancy working through the tutorial, then you'll find the project file ready to download at my website at shortformvideo.com. So I'm going to leave it there for now. Thanks for watching, hope you found it useful, and I'll see you next time.